Just sort of a starting note very quickly here for if we have any for any student preachers, maybe people who are thinking about preaching or teaching for that matter. Tell a little story just real quickly about nervousness. And I still get nervous. Nervousness is a good thing. First time I ever really had to speak in public was in the Air Force in 1980 when I got selected to be a training instructor. And as part of that class, they had a podium like this, but it was all made out of metal. And it had a metal door on the front of it where you could store stuff. And what they did is they put a microphone on it, and they had a big VHS monster camera back in the back. And one of your first jobs to do was to just get up and give a 2-minute introduction. Hi, my name's Airman so-and-so, and I come from this part of the... nothing other than just whatever you wanted to say for just a couple minutes. So I get up there, and I've got this death grip on this podium, and I'd done a little bit of speaking before, but not a whole lot. So I got my hand on this thing, and I can feel my knees. I'm actually using this to keep my knees from, collapsing underneath me. But at the end of it, I'm thinking, hey, I did pretty good. And so the instructor came back and says, okay, now we're going to review the tapes. Well, what I didn't realize was when the tape was played back, you couldn't hear a thing I said because the metal door was real loose on the front of the podium. So all you heard through my whole speech was dug, 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 the whole time. So it was pretty useless. And I'm sure that everybody else in the class wasn't paying any attention to what I was saying because they could hear that door down there shaking. But even to this day, tens of thousands of students later and bunches of sermons later, I still get nervous, a little bit of nervous. And nervousness is good. If you're doing public speaking and you're not nervous, then you're probably not a very good public speaker because it's just become too routine for you. So the key to it is to make sure that you know your material well and you get plenty of sleep beforehand, which I'm horrible at doing. But make sure you know your material well, and that's half the battle with doing that. And also keep in mind, a lot of people when they get up to speak, they're afraid that they're being criticized. And what you don't realize is one of the greatest fears people have is public speaking. So most people are there, they're very, very kind towards you because you're doing something they're deathly afraid of doing. So from that standpoint, also just don't look at them as hostile because they're not hostile. They're happy they're not up there having to do it, And you see the elders sometimes going around trying to get people to do some things. Hey, can you do the devotional? And they're like, deer in the headlights kind of look. No, I can't do that. I'll read a scripture. So when Greg asked me to fill in, he gave me the option of sticking with the material that he was covering. I don't like doing that. I think most teachers don't like doing that simply because you might miss something that the teacher wanted to cover. But I did tell him, I said, hey, we'll go ahead and stick within the book of Acts and kind of go into something in one area, maybe a little bit deeper. And so I want to focus in on one individual this morning. And just think for a little bit about, all the heroes in the Bible. And think about all the different ones who would be on your list. And we know, hey, Moses comes up, Abraham comes up, Paul comes up, Peter comes up, Noah, we go through a lot of those. And everyone kind of has their favorites for various numbers of reasons. Think just a little bit about who would be on your list. And then I want to ask a question, would Cornelius be on your list? Cornelius from Acts chapter 10. A lot of times what we have a tendency to do when we're going through different chapters and things like that, we kind of look at him and go, okay, he was a centurion, okay? First, he was basically wasn't really the very first Gentile convert as such, but he was the one that was basically given to say, hey, the gospel's coming to the Gentiles now in a very, very open and overt way by the things that happen with that. But we have a tendency to sort of brush over things a little bit sometimes and not think about the depth of information that's there regarding this individual. And there's really quite a bit with Cornelius that if you start thinking about it and doing a little bit of reading about it, instead of just being the name of this centurion and this miraculous event and his family being saved, there's much more depth to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. And since we've just recently gone through Acts chapter 10, I'm not going to go through all of it again. Hopefully everybody remembers the basic account is one of which God's basically going to bring salvation to the Gentiles and let the Jews know that, hey, the Gentiles are going to be part of this kingdom too. You can't keep separating yourselves from them. They're going to be your brothers and sisters whether you like it or not. And so he sends a message to Cornelius, and he says, the angel appears to him and says, hey, there's this Peter guy. I'm going to send for him. Go send for him. Come bring him to you. He's going to tell you what you need to do. And of course, then God basically goes to Peter and does the same thing. He says, look, here's the vision. Here's the unclean animals. And you got to understand here, I'm going to send you to a Gentile. And you got to go preach the gospel to a Gentile. He goes and preaches the gospel to the Gentile. Cornelius and his whole family, they're baptized, receive the Holy Spirit, and that's pretty much the account in a nutshell. But Acts chapter 10 doesn't really provide a lot of details on Cornelius, but we can fill in some of those blanks a little bit just from history. First of all, Cornelius, the name Cornelius is a Roman name, and it's a family name, and it comes from the Latin word cornu. And cornu is defined as a horn or a hoof or a beak, a tusk or a claw, a bow, a horn or a trumpet, the end wing of an army or a mountaintop. So what does that kind of sound like? What are all those terms? How would you categorize all of those terms? What do they sound like if you had to generally say what they kind of meant? What's that? Yeah, it's terms of power, isn't it? When you look at beaks and claws and horns and hoofs, you think about a cavalry horse charging on you. What part of it don't you want on you? 3,000-pound animal, you don't want their hoofs, on you, because that's pretty deadly. So, or the claws of an eagle. Have you ever seen a bald eagle before, in person? Have you seen how big their claws are? They're not an animal that you would want to mess around with. They could probably take a big chunk of your body off very quickly if that's what they chose to do. So it signifies great strength. And our English word cornucopia is from the Latin, and cornu meaning horn, and then copia meaning supply. It's also where we get the word copious from. So what's our common term, since we're getting close to Thanksgiving, right? What's our common term that's used for a cornucopia? What's the layman's term? What's that? What's the normal picture that we see at Thanksgiving? Which sometimes it's a picture we stick up on the wall or whatever. Remember, it's a horn-shaped thing. Horn of plenty. Thank you. Yes, and that's cornucopia is a horn of plenty. So that all comes from that time. So in essence, we see his name signifying something that he was a very strong individual. And of course, we're told that he's a Roman centurion. And there's some things about centurions you might not realize, and we're going to kind of look at some of those. You had to be at least 30 years old. So there was no such thing as early promotion to being a centurion. You had to have been in the military for 12 to 16 years before they would even consider you for the rank. So newbies didn't get to go and jump into that rank. It was someone who was experienced and someone who was proven. They had to be literate. All right, you couldn't be illiterate at all. You had to have connections. So you had to have recommendations. You had to have letters of recommendation to the role. You just couldn't come up and say, hey, I'm a tough guy, I want to be a centurion. No, there's people that are around that are aware of you, sort of like letters of reference if you want to look at it that way. And they had to be 5'8" in height. Well, is 5'8" horrendously tall? Well, it was then, right? I was fairly tall for a guy back then. I used to be 5'9", but now that I'm in my 60s, I'm not 5'9" anymore. But one of those things is that was a relatively tall individual. And we'll see why they had to be that height here in just a little bit. They were commoners, so they weren't from families of social standing. And they were also the professional full-time soldiers. They were the ones that were really responsible for all the training and everything else and setting up all the organization. The army was really controlled by the centurions. In our modern day military, some people kind of look at the officers and say, oh, it's the officers that are running everything. Well, in real life, no, they really aren't. It's still the NCOs that are still running things in the military. The bulk of the big stuff is done by those NCOs. In fact, most of the what we would call officers during the Roman times, a lot of them were political appointees, and they were people of different social status and really didn't have much in the way of military training. And so a lot of cases you had to be kind of careful of them because since they didn't have that military training, sometimes they'd get you into bad situations and get you into tactical issues when it comes down to that. The Roman historian Vegetius says the centurion in the infantry is chosen for his size, strength, and dexterity in throwing his weapon, for his skill in use of his sword and shield, in short, for his expertness in all the exercises. He is to be vigilant, temperate, active, and readier to execute the orders he receives than he is to talk. Strict in exercising and keeping up proper discipline among his soldiers and obliging them to appear clean and well-dressed and to have their arms constantly clean and bright. So we have already see this image forming of Cornelius, that Cornelius wasn't just some sort of backwater kind of supply guy in a military unit. He was actively expected to be strong and skilled in combat. Now, the other thing about centurion ranks is they suffered really heavy casualties in wartime. They led from the front of the battle. They stood in the right front corner of the century. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about how these wars were fought, you didn't stand off at a distance like we do today with cruise missiles and all this other stuff, or sitting inside big tanks or bombing from long distances with airplanes. That's just not the way it went. The formations, the good guys and the bad guys, all lined up in these big ranks, big long ranks, and then you closed on the enemy with your shields up, and then you just slammed into each other. And it was a pushing match. And you had your shield up against the enemy's shield on the other side, and you're pushing, and their shields are all interlocked, and what you're trying to do is take your little short sword and stick it around the corner and get it up underneath the guy's armpit. But mostly it was a pushing match. And if you started to push and the other guy started to give ground, guess what that often created? Panic, right? We're being pushed back, and someone goes, we're losing. And then when you break ranks, that's when the slaughter happens, because most of them didn't wear any armor in the back. So when you're running, you're pretty vulnerable. And so it was a battle of wills in most cases. Well, who's up in that very first rank coming into contact first? It's that centurion. And of course, you also know in battle, if you want to give problems to a unit, who do you take out first? Get rid of the officers first, right? Because they're supposed to be the leaders. And even though I said officer, he's the one that's out there. And the other officers, the real officers, they're up on a hill on horses watching all this stuff. The centurions and stuff are down there doing all the dirty work. So you want to take those guys out because they're the ones that are giving all the orders. And you can tell a centurion, and of course that's why they had to be 5'8" in height, because they had to be at least tall enough for everybody behind them to see them. because they were leading by example. And so, I don't know if you've ever seen their helmets, but a lot of the Roman helmets, the soldiers, they had a horsehair like brush thing that went up on the top like this. Well, the normal legionary, it went this way. But if you're centurion, it went across this way. And so all you had to do is look up and look for that horsehair brush thing that was going across sideways. It's easy for you to see. You know who the boss is. And so does the enemy, because they know by how he's dressed. And of course, he had metal greaves, and he wore a sword on the other side. The other thing the centurions did is they carried a vine stick. It was a grapevine stick that had been specially hardened in a fire and everything else, so it wasn't like a willow switch or anything like that. This was basically, it was a symbol of authority, but they also used it to motivate people sometimes. If somebody get out of line a little bit, centurion would pull out his stick and schwack the guy on the head, or wherever it would hurt the worst. And so, that was very much a feared implement, but it was also a symbol of authority to identify their role. And in a lot of cases, their men actually made that particular stick for them, which is kind of weird, right? You're going to go make the stick for the thing that the guy's going to use to beat you with when you mess up. Sort of like Grandma telling you to go get the willow switch off the tree when you're in trouble. And they led their men, by example, and they really worked hard to display the skill and courage that brought them to their rank in the first place. So we're starting to kind of see an unfolding here of the character, because all of these characteristics were required of centurions. Had they not done that, had they not had these characteristics, guess what would have happened? Yeah, they would have been booted out. They would have never got there in the first place. They would have been pushed off to the side. And because of this attitude of displaying skill and courage, well, guess what that means in battle? They're kind of the first to go. And they actually suffered disproportionate amounts of casualties compared to other troops, purely because they were more pressing the attack and being more vigilant and working harder to be the ones that are actually leading by example. And in fact, it wasn't the norm for centurions to reach retirement. Lots and lots of them died in battle. So you figure, hey, you can sign up for something. Oh, I want to be a centurion so that I'll never get a retirement. But if you did, and you made it, then things worked out good for you, because there was a lot of benefit to it. Now, a lot of times when we're talking about centurions, in Bible classes we'll say, okay, so who is a centurion? Centurion was someone who was in charge of, a lot of people say 100 men. Centurion was actually in charge of 80 soldiers, and then there was a 20 or 30 or so different people that were admin, slaves, and stuff like that, but you actually commanded about 80 soldiers. And then they'll say, that's it. That's what a centurion was. No, there were 60 grades of centurion as you climbed up through the ranks. So it's kind of a generalization to say a centurion was just someone who took care of 80 soldiers. As they move up through the ranks, then you have a centurion in charge of a cohort. They have 480 soldiers. You get up to the very top, the top guy in the legion, he had 60 sentries that he looked out for, or 4,800 soldiers. All of those ranks within the centurion roles. So we can't really just generalize it and say, oh, a centurion did this, especially when there's 60 ranks of them. In the Air Force, in the enlisted ranks, we've got 9, and that's it. I can't imagine 60 just amongst the centurions. Probably why they had to have so many administrative people, just to keep all that stuff straight on paper. Keep in mind also, when we start talking about this, the centurion being the leader of a cohort, which he was, had 480 soldiers. That was the size of group that came to get Jesus in the garden. And then also when Paul was escorted from Jerusalem to Caesarea, or to Caesarea, depending on whichever way you want to say it, was also another cohort, 480 men. Do you really think that, Paul or Jesus really had to have an escort of 480 armed soldiers and cavalry? Kind of overkill, isn't it, a little bit? So you kind of wonder exactly what their reasonings were for sending that many people. Whether they were afraid of riots and things like that, which may be what was going on, because even the Pharisees and the priests a lot of times were afraid of the people rioting for doing things to Jesus. So it may have just been very well, okay, it's better to just send a ton and be safe than it is to just send a few and maybe run into some problems. Cornelius, like I said, was the leader of a cohort, as the Greek word indicates, and he was high-ranking since he commanded that cohort, but he also had the authority to dispatch a soldier on a personal errand. And that's one thing that shows that he was high-ranking. Lower-ranking centurions would not have been able to dispatch someone on a personal errand like the one that Cornelius did in sending the delegation to go get Peter. Also, the other thing is, Cornelius, another thing that shows that he was pretty high standing is that he had his family there with him. Anybody lower of the lower ranks, of the lower ranking legionnaires and the legionaries, I get that mixed up, okay? Legionnaires are the guys that work that are part of the American Legion. Legionaries are soldiers in the Roman army. It's hard to get mixed up. They get mixed up like cavalry and cavalry. So anyway, those lower-ranking soldiers couldn't even get married. From the time of Augustus, they couldn't get married until they achieved higher ranks. Scripture tells us that Cornelius was part of the Italian cohort, and it was named Cohors to Italica, and it was comprised of soldiers mainly from Italy itself. It was formed in 9 AD under Augustus Caesar, and it served in Germany, which was a bad place for the Roman army, and they lost a lot of soldiers in Germany at that time. And then they were transferred to Palestine, to Judea in AD 17. And then later on in their history, the Jews finally started getting really crusty with stuff and getting really rough around the edges, started getting revolting. And in AD 66, they had to send Vespasian in, and the legion that Cornelius had been part of, or the cohort, was formed into that, and they took part in putting down that first revolt. Didn't stick. And then in AD 70, then Titus had to come in, and that's when they finally came in and said, okay, we've had enough of this, and they basically just burned the temple to the ground. They besieged Jerusalem, burned the temple to the ground, and basically that then just shut down any more rebellion out of the Jews after that. But keep in mind that by the time these big revolts happened, because of the age that Cornelius was, he would have been long retired by now, assuming that he survived his time in the Roman military. And he was stationed at Caesarea, a coastal city about 50 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It was a seat of government in Palestine and Syria at the time, and that's where the Roman governor lived. That's where the king lived prior. And in the Praetorium. And Cornelius' cohort would have been responsible for the security of the governor and for that Praetorium. So he's got a great responsibility there. He's not some sort of backwater kind of guy with that. There would have been other troops stationed throughout the land trying to kind of keep the peace and keep the robbers down and stuff. So not all of the military units were stationed there in Caesarea, but the security group was there at the time. And the other thing is that the bulk of the troops stayed in Caesarea, and they only went to Jerusalem when they had to. because nobody liked going to Jerusalem. And that may sound kind of weird, but think about this for just a little bit. Think about Jerusalem. Jerusalem was this ancient, old walled city up on top of a mountain. Had at the time an estimated population of about 40,000 people, and it sat on a plot of land of about 230 acres. Right? And a lot of times in our minds we have paint Jerusalem in our minds of a Memphis, right? Big sprawling city. Okay, Jerusalem, are some of you at least familiar with the Micros soccer complex right down here, right down the street on the right? Okay, about twice the size of the Micros soccer complex is the land area for the city of Jerusalem. And then you're packing 40,000 people into that. And then keep in mind, some of that space is filled up with what? The temple, all the different palaces, different businesses and things like that. So living spaces were really, really crammed together. It was high density population. It was up on top of this mountain. There wasn't anything nearby to do or anything like that. So it wasn't a particularly fun place to go. But if we start then thinking in terms of Caesarea, it was a young city. It was built during the time of between 20 and 10 BC. It's on the Mediterranean coast. With all the amenities of modern Roman living. First-class man-made harbor, which means you get easy transportation and lots of nice trade goods. It had an amphitheater. It had a hippodrome. Anybody know what a hippodrome was? What's that? Circus is another term for it. It's a racetrack. It's a horse racetrack. Hippo being the Greek word for horse. So they had a hippodrome there. They had an aqueduct that brought in fresh water, which meant you could have a sewage system, a freshwater running sewage system, and a large, lavish palace for the governor, the king, whoever happened to be in power at the time. So if you're a Roman and you have to be in Palestine, which was really considered to be the armpit of the Roman Empire, they really did look at it that way. It's like, you'll be out here in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it's like, well, I can live in Branson or I can live in Midland, Texas. If you've been to both places, I think you know why you might prefer one over the other. I was going to say it'd be the difference between living in Nashville and Byhalia, Mississippi, but I live in Byhalia, or on the edge of it now, so I didn't want to insult my fellow citizens because they'd take away my smoker probably. So because of this reason, they just preferred to stay in Caesarea and only go to Jerusalem when they had to. And of course, the Jews, they never really fully accepted the idea of being part of the Roman Empire. They really didn't like it. And of course, they had the promised land, right? And it's like, wait a minute, this land's been promised to us. Why are you taking it away from us? Why are you taking this away from us? So it's kind of hard to not be resentful for someone who comes and steals your stuff. And that's kind of the way that they looked at that. And of course, especially then levying the taxes on top of it. And I know we've talked in other classes about how crooked a lot of the stuff was with levying those taxes. Interesting thing, because of the problem with the Jews, during the first century there were more Roman troops in Palestine than any other place in the world at the time. That's how much of a hotbed it was. Everybody else kind of adapted. Palestine never really did. Roman attitudes. The Romans thought they were superior, and they viewed the other peoples and other cultures as being inferior, except the Greeks. They liked the Greeks. And in fact, you were kind of a lower class Roman citizen if you couldn't speak Greek. And they would ask you, oh, do you speak Greek? No, I don't. Oh, well, we're sorry for your disability that you can't do that. So the higher ranking people could do that. Most of the Roman soldiers held contempt for the peoples that they conquered because they felt, we're the best culture in the world and you're not. we're the best, you're not even close to us. So there's a certain arrogance. And even though it was prohibited, there was a lot of the Roman troops who kind of oppressed the people. They pillaged things sometimes. They committed assaults on some occasions. And even though it was officially prohibited, the officers, if they weren't doing the same thing, then they would just kind of turn a blind eye to things. So that doesn't do anything for community relations either in that respect. Especially to have some unclean Gentile guy, coming up and touching your wife, who's ceremonial clean, and now it's like, great, got pork on her from the sausage he ate for breakfast. Great. Gonna have to go through all sorts of stuff again. And if we remember too, think about Matthew 5:41, where it says, if someone forces you to go a mile with them, it says go 2. Well, that ties back to the Romans too, that they could legally, if they were walking, they could impress someone to actually carry the burden for them for a mile. That was part of the rules at the time. And of course, then we had the Roman colonies, and those Roman colonies were formed for the benefit of retiring veterans. And basically what they did was they came along and Rome said, hey, would you like to live in Caesarea? Real nice place on the coast. And they said, well, that would be great. So they just basically go in and confiscate all the land, all the houses in the area, and then they give it to the centurions that are retiring, or the Roman soldiers that are retiring, as part of their retirement benefit plan. Well, again, how endearing are you going to be with the people where you come in and take their stuff that they've had for generations and say, well, we're giving it to this guy who conquered you, and now you have nothing. So it doesn't play well for that. And they got tax exempt status, so they didn't have to pay taxes either. So that was a good deal for them. But think about the amazing contrast that we find in Cornelius. He's really devoid of prejudice. We don't see the concept in the book that he's looking down on the Jewish people. We see just the opposite, don't we? So in that sense, he's not the typical Roman. In fact, rather than being contemptuous of the race and customs, he shows them courtesy and respect. And that lack of prejudice is mostly seen in his adopting the God of the conquered. He's taking on their God to worship. And he had abandoned those gods and traditions of Rome and submitted himself to the one true God. According to chapter 2, he was a God-fearer. And interesting thing about this is the Jews applied this term to a class of people who attached themselves to the synagogue and participated in Jewish worship without becoming full proselytes. So that term's a very specific term. And from my discussions with some rabbis today, that term still applies. They still use that. You'd be welcome to go attend any synagogue as a Gentile and worship with them. And they're happy to do that. Because the synagogues were considerably different from what the temple was. We have a tendency sometimes to implant images of the temple over synagogue, and there really are two completely different, distinct sorts of things. And in fact, there's a number of synagogues throughout the ancient Roman Empire that have inscriptions of tribute to centurions who paid to help build their synagogue. So that's an interesting side note with that. Now, as far as Roman religion goes, they believed in many gods, but for the Roman military, the Roman gods were really an obsession. Okay, if you didn't honor the gods, especially Mars, it was tantamount to treason. And if you didn't go to the gods and worship them correctly before you went into battle, then you knew you were going to lose the battle. This is so important to them that they even brought pagan priests with them on campaigns with portable pagan shrines and altars and stuff so that they could worship the god before the battle. And if it didn't get done right, then all the men panicked because they believed that Mars wasn't going to be with them because they didn't do things right. Of course, they did silly things like watching what direction a bird flew when the sun came up, and taking a goat and cutting open its liver and reading the liver and looking at the spots to determine whether I always kind of wondered about a God like Mars who couldn't just send you a memo, right, about what he wanted you to do. No, I'm going to put this in a liver of a goat, and you're going to have to read it, and hopefully you know what it says. Like, and not very happy for the goat either, if you look at it. And want to guess who was responsible to make sure all those religious things were met? It was the centurions. So Cornelius would have initially been responsible to make sure that those things happened. But what does he do? He courageously bucks the system. Okay? In a system where they say, if you don't worship our gods, it's going to be treason. And Cornelius says, no, I'm going to worship the one true God. Can you imagine the peer pressure that might have created within his cohort, within the Roman army as a whole, to have someone doing that? Hey, dude, you're threatening our whole campaign because you're going to offend our God. And Cornelius still sticks with it. In verse 2, it says he's a devout man. And this word devout in the Greek is eusebes, and it means holy awe or reverence toward the gods or God, and it shows itself in activity. So this tells me his faith was demonstrated in active deeds. He had a working faith, as we would say today. And also notice in verse 7 that one of his soldiers is also described as devout. And it's the same Greek word, so I would almost take it to believe that not only was Cornelius God-fearing, but this soldier that he had also with him was also in the same boat and was also a God-fearing a man, even though he's a soldier. And what sort of things did Cornelius do that showed his faith and reverence? Well, it certainly wasn't worshiping in the temple, was it? Because what was the issue with Cornelius trying to go to the temple? Yeah, he's a Gentile, right? That would not been good for him to do that. He could go to the court of the Gentiles, but there really wasn't any worship that went on in the court of the Gentiles. So what did he do? He couldn't be prevented from praying, so it says that's what he did always and continually. And so we find he's the kind of person who lived what he prayed. And how did we see that? And it says he gave much alms to the people, much alms that were mercy and compassion. He felt compassion towards these people of God, and so he helped them. Maybe he did give some money towards helping to build a synagogue, like so many other centurions happened to do. But this word of alms is any act that you demonstrate your love by deeds and kindness. But in what ways do Cornelius' actions seem contradictory to being a Roman centurion? I mean, in your image, in your head, when you think of a centurion, what do you think of? You think of just some sort of like 90-pound weakling that is easily pushed around and, waffles on every subject, and you can barely hear him when he talks? Or do you get this impression of Sergeant Rock, right? Big, strong, tough guy, right? Tough guy. What's the old saying? Tough as nails. Put a nail in his mouth and bite it in half. I mean, that's the image that most people have of centurions. They are rough and tumble. They got to keep all these guys in track. If you let the soldiers go and don't keep some discipline on them, they'll get out of control, and they'll end up doing their own thing. So you have to rule with an iron fist in a lot of cases. And yet, do we see that? People think, military guys are heartless killers, right? Does that sound like Cornelius? I'm sure he killed plenty of people, but yet what do we hear in his words and his actions? He has compassion towards these people, so there's this other side to him. I don't know if you know this, but even today, just about every place the American military goes, you see all the war footage and all this other stuff and blowing things up and shooting the guns and stuff, but what you don't see in the background is the orphanages that are rebuilt on their own time when they're off duty. the social programs that they get involved in. And not because someone comes along and says, do this, they just spontaneously do it. They'll be walking by an orphanage that's gotten blown up, and they'll look at each other and go, man, we should help these orphans out. And the next thing you know, they're out there gathering up lumber. They're tearing apart buildings they don't need on base to haul the lumber off base in the middle of the night to go build an orphanage, and everybody's going to the PX or the commissary and grabbing food to take and stock up. And when we left Incirlik in 2003, we delivered 6 tractor trailer loads of food to the orphanage that was there. You know, and people don't see that, but it's a common thread with many people in the military, and that's what I see here with Cornelius. And of course, we see also that he was one who feared God with all of his household. So he was a spiritual leader within his family as well, and that's an example for us as husbands and fathers. And then the angel has instructed Cornelius to send for Peter. And the angel says, you know, Peter will speak the words to you by which you will be saved, you and your household. Now note that an angel was sent directly to Peter. It was in a vision, but sent directly to Cornelius. That's an honor in itself, isn't it? You know, it could have just come from someone else, a messenger that was sent, said, hey, someone's coming to tell you about this. No, this was the importance. It was an honor because God has chosen Cornelius. You think about the number of times that happens. You think about choosing when he chose Job. And why did he choose Job? Why did he choose Job? Because of Job's character. Anytime we see God choosing people, it says something amazing about their character. Okay? And so we have to know about Cornelius that he's got something amazing in his character. And it also, the scripture already says that Cornelius had already heard about Jesus' ministry, and that's plainly stated in verses 37 and 38 that he was aware of that, whether it was because of his contact with Christians and legal dealings that are going on, but possibly also overhearing conversations in the Praetorium. Military units are extremely gossipy. You know the old saying about gossipy washwomen and stuff? Military units put gossipy washwomen to shame. Okay? In fact, rumor control and gossiping is something you have to really work to keep down because they'll just go crazy with it if you don't put a halt to it. Some really stupid stuff happens because of it. But also on a related note, the events of Acts chapter 10 end up being somewhere between 35 and 40 AD. So where does that put that close to? The crucifixion of Jesus, right? Now, scriptures don't tell us, but because Cornelius was in charge of the Praetorium, remember who was all involved with the crucifixion of Jesus? The Praetorian Guard, right? They were all there. It may very well be that he was there. We don't know that for sure, but at least he was aware of those events that were going on. And of course, then we also realize that what happens with Cornelius in that time that he's waiting for Peter to show up, he gathers all of his family there. That's also a great indication of his abilities as a leader. Because what is he really doing by doing that? He's putting others first. He's thinking of his family and his friends before he's thinking of himself. Even before he's saved, he's saying, I got to get these people here because they're important to me. And that's definitely the hallmark of a great leader. And as we kind of conclude this, I love the words spoken by Cornelius to Peter in verse 33. He says, now then, we are all here present before God to hear all that you have been commanded by the Lord. And I like these words because you can hear a couple things. You can hear the authority in his voice. You can hear the centurion coming out in him saying, we're here. We're here to hear what you have to say. Everybody in the room, shut up, listen. He's got something important to say. And yet on the other side, we hear the humility in his words, which is, I want to hear what you have to say, versus I'm going to tell you what you're going to tell me. And that shows a lot about his character. And certainly these are qualities of great leaders and of great Christians. And Cornelius is a truly extraordinary man, one that we can admire, and he's really a man that we should imitate in many ways. Just from the standpoint that he was trying so hard, and yet when presented with, okay, here's what more you have to do, did he hesitate? Did he question? He just said, oh, okay, everybody come on, let's get baptized. That's what we got to do. And that's an admirable trait for all of us. So thank you very much for your time. Hope you got a little bit more depth about Cornelius.